Senior Conservatives urge Boris Johnson to refocus his government after the departure of his controversial advisor, Dominic Cummings. Out of Downing Street after internal power struggles, Mr Cummings' exit was publicly welcomed by several MPs.
We are enormously fond of the Prime Minister and we did feel that he'd been taken away from us.
And the other main stories on tonight's programme. Fearing for their future, the 3 million workers excluded from the government's coronavirus support schemes. President Trump urges on supporters in Washington, but what is the effect of his baseless assertions of electoral fraud? And Diwali celebrations across the world despite the COVID-19 restrictions. Good evening. Several senior Conservatives have urged the Prime Minister to use the departure of his chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, to reset government. Mr Cummings walked out of Downing Street last night after the resignation of another senior figure, the Director of Communications, Lee Kane. The former Brexit Secretary, David Davis, told the BBC that ministers are now hoping for more of a say in how the country is governed. Our political correspondent, Nick Eardley, reports.
The Dominic Cummings era in government is coming to an end. Boris Johnson wants to clear the air in Downing Street, and that means his chief aide, seen here this morning, leaving home, won't be returning to number 10. The way this place works matters to us all, to how decisions are made, to the direction of policy. After the very high-profile departures of recent days and some of the drama inside, some Tories are hoping for a change.
It does give the government a chance to reset all sorts of things. Its relationship with Parliament, the way it deals with the press, I'm told its relationship with the Cabinet. And many of the failures of the last 9 months have not been Mr Cummings' fault, they've been intrinsic in the system.
There have been many unhappy Tory MPs in recent months, angry at high-profile U-turns, worried the Prime Minister wasn't listening to them. One of them told me changes in the top team would be important.
It's going to make an enormous difference. Over the past year, there has been a significant and growing gap between the number 10 operation and the parliamentary party. We're enormously fond of him and we felt we were losing him. And some colleagues felt that he'd been lost altogether. But now we're looking forward to marching in lockstep alongside our Prime Minister.
This is the Prime Minister last night with another key aide, Lee Kane. Mr Kane quit after a power struggle over whether he'd be Mr Johnson's Chief of Staff. Allies say his departure and that of Dominic Cummings was amicable, but those said to be unhappy with Mr Kane's role included the Prime Minister's fiancée, Carrie Simons. After the faction fights of recent days, the man who ran number 10 for Theresa May says the Prime Minister now has a chance to get things back on track.
There's a big opportunity for him here, depending on the decisions that he now makes. But I think in terms of the Chief of Staff role, the key thing that I would say is that the most important word in the job title is staff, not chief. You're there not to try and deliver your own political agenda, your own views about what should happen to the country, but to make the government machine work for the Prime Minister.
And there are big decisions to be made. Boris Johnson will have to decide in the next couple of weeks whether to sign up to a trade deal with Europe. He'll be making that decision without two of his key Brexit allies by his side. He'll also have to decide what happens when the lockdown ends on the 2nd of December. Remember, many Tories are desperate for him to lift the restrictions. Let's be clear, these are decisions for the Prime Minister, not for his aides. But after some of the drama of the last few days, there are many hoping the decision-making process might be a bit smoother.
Nick, many thanks. Nick Eardley there. The latest government figures show that there were 26,860 new coronavirus infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. That means that the average number of new cases reported per day in the last week is now 24,702. 1,617 people have been admitted to hospital on average each day over the week to last Tuesday. And 462 deaths were reported. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. It means on average in the past week, 411 deaths were announced every day. And it takes the total number of deaths so far across the UK to 51,766. The government's decision to extend the furlough scheme and to increase help for the self-employed has brought relief to millions of workers. But many are still falling through the gaps. It's thought that 2.9 million people, from freelancers and contractors to small business owners, are still excluded in some way from the Chancellor's income support schemes. Rishi Sunak says he's doing all he can, but as Emma Simpson now reports, the financial pressure is building for those who've missed out.
98% of our earnings have gone.
The rug was pulled from under our feet.
Now it's sleepless nights.
Ian and Lindsay run a successful corporate catering business.
There's the roasted turkey with.
They should be flat out right now. Instead, they're not sure if any of these dishes will be made. Ian's a limited company director, so they're only entitled to £480 each a month on furlough. They've been using savings set aside for tax bills and a bounce-back loan to keep going.
It's not going to last forever, and
There'll come a point in time, obviously, when
there'll be no money.
There'll be
Pot's
nothing,
empty.
and the pot's empty, and we'll have nowhere to, we've got nowhere to hide then.
And then it doesn't make sense why we kept our staff on if the business goes under, because why support businesses by giving staff furlough, keeping them employed, only for them to lose their job because the business wasn't supported in the first place.
They want the Chancellor to give them the same support as everyone else.
And I'd like to beg him, if necessary, to help those that need it, because at the moment people are suicidal.
Ian and Lindsay feel as if they're on borrowed time, but for others, the timer's already run out. Some have lost everything they've worked for because they've fallen between the cracks.
At the beginning of the lockdown in March, it was really about getting support out quickly to those who needed it. And there wasn't much time for the government to think about how best to target support. But now that the support packages have been extended once again, the government should be thinking about how best to target support to those who need it.
There's always a cast of thousands at the end of a blockbuster movie. Many of them are self-employed, like Louise Burton. But this contract ruled her out for self-employment job support.
Oh, I'm focusing on this for a while. I pay tax. Why shouldn't I be eligible for any kind of support? It makes me furious. And, my mental health has been suffering because of this crisis. I know self-employment is hard and I know the industry is hard, but you never expect to be left out quite like this.
The Treasury says it's delivered one of the most comprehensive packages of support in the world. But 8 months on, the pressure's increasing to do more to help the millions who've missed out. Emma Simpson, BBC News.
Supporters of President Trump have been rallying in Washington, D.C. to back his unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud in the US election. The demonstrations came after the president-elect Joe Biden was projected to have won the state of Georgia. Since election night, President Trump has tweeted dozens of times promoting claims of voter fraud without providing any evidence. Experts now fear that online disinformation has undermined faith in democracy for millions, as Mariana Spring reports.
Stop the steal! Stop the steal!
In Washington today, protesters took to the streets making unsubstantiated claims that the election was rigged, with Donald Trump even driving through the crowds. Small demonstrations started before Joe Biden was declared US president-elect. This is why.
This is a case where they're trying to steal an election. They're trying to rig an election, and we can't let that happen.
Hashtag Stop the Steal went viral after unsubstantiated allegations that the Democrats had rigged and stolen the election. But seeds of mistrust in the democratic process were sown long before election night. Trump tweeted allegations of voter fraud and election rigging over 70 times in the build-up to polling day. It's not a new theme. He made claims about fraud back in 2016 too. The difference this time is that lots more people have been seeing it all over social media for weeks and joining big Facebook groups.
I'm an admin of the Stop the Steal group on Facebook. Our movement believes that fraud has occurred and we're angry.
I just think the voter fraud in this election, just with the mail-in ballots, those have been a concern. President Trump will be the winner after there is an honest recount in the states and fraudulent votes are thrown out.
The experts are worried about its imminent and lasting impact.
There were all of these breadcrumbs and a whole narrative framework that there was a foregone conclusion that the Democrats were going to steal the election, and now we just have to watch the ways they're trying to do it.
Social media sites have been struggling to keep up with a new wave of misleading posts.
Where's our vote?
The big worry going forwards is that viral disinformation risks seriously undermining the faith of millions in democracy. Mariana Spring, BBC News.
Forces in Ethiopia's northern Tigray region have fired rockets at airports in the neighbouring state of Amhara as their conflict with the government grows. Tensions between them have escalated into military clashes in the past month. The UN Refugee Agency says at least 17,000 people have fled across the border into Sudan, some pouring across a river in small boats. Time for the sport now. Here's Ollie Foster at the BBC Sports Centre. Ollie.
Evening, Rita. It's been another good day for Rory McIlroy at Augusta, but he's some way off the pace after his third round at the Masters. At one point, there was a 9-way tie for the lead, but the American Dustin Johnson is currently 4 shots clear. Here's our sports correspondent, Andy Swiss.
Perfect conditions at Augusta for some near-perfect golf, as Dustin Johnson set about proving just why he's the world #1.
This guy's on fire.
The American was soon surging clear, but among the chasers was Rory McIlroy. An excellent 67 from him, but he'll need something extraordinary tomorrow. Other hopes, though, may have already vanished. Not even the Woods could rescue Woods. Tiger's title defence surely over. And chances of an English winner are also fading. A disappointing 76 for Justin Rose, and although he conjured one of the shots of the day,
Yes. Oh, yes.
there wasn't much else to smile about. Instead, there were more unheralded challengers, South Korea's Sung Jae-im making his move. But it's Dustin Johnson that leads the way, a superb round from him, and on this form, he'll take some beating. Andy Swiss, BBC News.
In Rugby Union's Autumn Nations Cup, Scotland had a scare in Italy but won 28-17. It was far more straightforward for England. 40-0 winners against Georgia at Twickenham. Ben Croucher reports.
Rugby at Twickenham in 2020 looks a bit different. England are playing in blue for starters. The kits and players may change, the form has stayed constant, with Jack Willis on debut opening his international account for the Six Nations champions. It's a competition Georgia harbour hopes of joining, but 3 more first-half tries demonstrated the gulf between them. Jamie George had already scored 2 tries like this when he became the first English hooker to score a hat-trick. The close-range tactic worked for Dan Robson too, as Georgia's first visit to Twickenham was a pointless one. There's been a change in the air in Scottish sport of late. Their male footballers are on a roll and the rugby counterparts are on their best run this century. It was a tepid start in Tuscany though, as Italy found some Florence flair to lead at half-time. Scotland needed something a bit different to turn in their favour. Xander Fagerson, a former chorister and mountain biker turned prop forward, found his path to the Italian try line similarly unique. Scotland ecstatic, Italy just static. Then fast moving backwards as 2 more Scottish scores earned them a 5th straight win in this different but impressive year. Ben Croucher, BBC News.
England's women have gone 1-0 up in their test series against France. The Six Nations champions won 33-10 in Grenoble. Jess Breach scored one of their 3 tries. The 2 sides meet again at Twickenham next Saturday. Lewis Hamilton will start from 6th on the grid for tomorrow's Turkish Grand Prix in Istanbul. He struggled in the wet conditions but was still faster than his Mercedes teammate Valtteri Bottas, his only championship rival. And if he finishes ahead of him tomorrow, he'll clinch a record equalling 7th world title. The Canadian Lance Stroll there took a surprise maiden pole position. Lots more, of course, on the BBC Sport website, including all today's goals from the Women's Super League. Rita.
Thank you, Ollie. Now, Diwali, the Festival of Light, is being celebrated today by hundreds of millions of Hindus, Sikhs and Jains around the world. Festivities this year have been limited by the pandemic, but people have found new ways of coming together. And a happy Diwali to all who are celebrating. You can see more on today's stories on the BBC News channel. That's all from me. Good night.